starting. Hi, Lynn. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me related to large language models and dialogue.
Hi. Thank you.
Um,
Thanks
so,
for including me in this.
oh, thank you. So you have done a lot of, I mean, it was impossible not to include you. You have done a lot of great work in dialogue, which I have been following all my career. So thanks a lot for doing the interesting, exciting work in the past. So, Lynn, there's a lot of excitement, and we have been talking about this with you for some time as well. So much advancements in the language models these days, with several of them being available to public for trying and so on. What do you think about the implications for dialogue?
Oh, well, I actually, I thought about like retiring, and it's impossible to even think about retiring right now because it's like the most exciting time in our field ever, my whole career. So I mean, there's so many different things that you could do now that you couldn't even like 3 years ago. Like some of the recent work that you and other people have done, like with the places dialogue generation or the soda dialogue generation, to use a large language model to generate whole dialogues and be able to then use those for training data. The whole idea that you could use a really large language model that's not real time to generate data that you could then train a smaller language model that is real time. You could fine tune it on that data. I think that's like super exciting. Opens up all kinds of possibilities that we never had before. The stuff that you can do, like things with knowledge grounding or controllable generation with knowledge or dialogue acts. I think that's really opens up a lot of possibilities that, like right now, the large language models that are used for dialogue, most of them aren't controllable. And so when people try to use those for user interaction, they have to put all kinds of guardrails about them. Probably still need some guardrails, even if you had more controllable NLG, for, biased or hallucinations or things like that, or contradiction. You probably still need some guardrails, but I think it could get a lot better. There's a lot of possibilities there to improve what's out there.
Yeah, and you already hinted, like with the hallucination and biased, toxic outputs and so on. But what are some of the things that are kind of like maybe missing from the bigger picture, or maybe you feel like the community language modeling community is not paying too much attention to maybe things that are specific to or related to dialogue?
Well, the thing that I think I kind of already hinted at, like when you talk to people about, for example, open domain dialogue, like in the Alexa Prize, they don't seem to distinguish between open domain dialogue, like you would need to have an engaging Alexa Prize agent, and an open domain dialogue that might have been trained on like movie scripts, film scripts. So people don't seem to realize that you need some knowledge, and maybe even live knowledge behind as part of the engine behind the agent, or else you can't get specific, engaging, and interesting utterances that are going to keep the user wanting to talk to the system. So that's one thing where I think there's a big disconnect. I mean, every time I give a presentation or I talk about like that kind of social chit chat where it's actually grounded in some knowledge or up-to-date information, people don't seem to recognize that that's an issue, that you really need it. I mean, a lot of the companies recognize it. Like if you look at Google's Lambda language model, it's got this toolkit and it's got ways for you to interface with APIs and stuff. But the research community, to me, that not enough of the research community seems to recognize that that's one of the major challenges of being able to integrate interesting and up-to-date information into a conversation. And maybe the same thing with dialogue acts. Like I gave a keynote at the IWSCS workshop about controlling dialogue acts in natural language generation. And one of the questions I got. I can't remember who it was from, but somebody said, you don't need to. Why do you think you need to control dialogue acts? And I said, well, it's a pretty boring conversation. If all you could produce is back channels, or all you could produce is inform statements, that's a pretty boring conversation. And a lot of the training data for natural language generation systems that's out there, it doesn't even have a dialogue act label, because the assumption is that all you're doing is informing, right? And so I said, I was surprised that somebody would say, oh, you don't need to control what dialogue act the system's producing. You just need to produce a good utterance. I'm going, it's not true. You can't sustain a conversation for 10 minutes with just a bunch of informed statements. So those are two things that I think that I'm really interested in personally, that I don't think people recognize, that those are both such big issues with having a conversational system.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Actually, you're bringing up a very good point, in the sense that much of these examples that people have been putting out there, or people have been trying, are more like fevered terms. But it would be really difficult, and you have a lot of experience from Alexa Price, with actual users, interactions with actual users, it would be quite challenging to maintain or pursue the conversation for many turns if it is just like only does inform and nothing else, does not take any initiative, ask you any questions, like try to engage you in an interaction.
It would be the most boring conversation ever, right?
That is very true.
I mean, you've probably been in conversations like that with somebody that are really one-sided. You can't wait to get out. Right?
Exactly.
And all they're doing is telling you a bunch of stuff. It's not so good, right?
Yeah. So in a way, I was thinking, like, maybe for task-oriented dialogue, usually there are like companies or maybe service providers for you to do the task completion, and they may actually want some level of higher level control, not just like at the utterance level, but at the dialogue level, because they may have policies or the way that they would want the system to do things. But it actually is very similar for open domain dialogue too, then, right? Like, you need to have like some maybe even higher level control over a longer session.
That is true. But in order to have a policy, you have to be able to control stuff at the utterance level, right? So first you need to have some control at the utterance level, and then you can use those controls at the policy level. It's still, actually, that's an interesting point. It's still hard to get training data to learn a policy.
It is still very hard. Exactly. And now I'm thinking, like, what could be some ways, like maybe some prompt, but then it's like it could be something really big. Does it scale? That does, the context may not scale.
You can't. With the current language models, the like sample dialogues that come out, I don't think you can expect. I don't know. Maybe it's worth looking at whether, for example, you could put dialogue act labels on that places corpus that you guys just generated, and then see how varied it is. I mean, you didn't evaluate it that way to see like how varied the policy is, whether it, but it seems like if you look at the examples, like the users, the simulated speakers, they ask each other questions, they take turns, they do a lot of stuff. So maybe the language model without any guidance is actually showing a good policy for the dialogue. That could be that's a good idea.
To examine, yes.
Maybe an obvious one that's a follow-on from your work. I haven't looked that closely at the SOTA corpus yet, but I know it does seem to have a very varied dialogue acts. But one of the things that we've seen with some of the smaller language models, like when we tried to use like BlenderBot in Alexa Prize, it doesn't have enough variation in it like asks too many questions that change the topic, or it just produces some kind of backward looking dialogue act, like an agreement or an acknowledgement of what the user said. And it doesn't have the kind of variety. So at least at least for some of the models that are out there, they're not naturally producing the kind of variety and dialogue acts that you would want them to produce.
Yeah. Maybe with some probing, but not yet. You're right. Not as is, not in the given forms. So, because we did talk about like two types of dialogue systems, social conversations, and then task oriented, and I never liked them, like just having two different forms. Kind of, it's like human interaction at the end of the day. But for the purposes of like having the being able to solve these as problems, I think it was kind of like a necessary direction from the two communities. But now it kind of feels like maybe we can just bring them together. Like maybe we don't have to have that separation between the two different types of systems. What do you think? What do you think about that?
I think that there is a lot of potential there for blending the two things together. So one of the things is that when people write papers about meaning to text or data to text generation, they usually assume that that's going to be, the context is going to be a task-oriented dialogue. But one of the things that's kind of different about the work that my team has done is that we're using meaning to text generation to get more specific, engaging, and interesting utterances in the context of social dialogue. So kind of right there, you have the intersection between the two things. And when I think about things like, well, let's imagine that you had a dialogue agent who could watch a soccer game with you and answer questions about the players and make comments like, you know, like the probability of getting a goal, like the kinds of things that my husband knows, the probability of getting a goal when the ball is being kicked in from that corner of the field is only like, you know, 1 in 15 or, you know, whatever. Those, so if you had, let's imagine you had like a sports bot that could do stuff like that. It's kind of hard to say. It's not really task oriented. You're not trying to necessarily complete a transaction. You know, you're not trying to book anything. You may not have a specific information goal, but I think it's clearly something that, you know, it's customized to a very specific knowledge domain, and it could provide, you know, a lot of value. So there's these potential dialogue systems that are kind of in the intersection in terms of the research that go into making them happen, right? So like that one I just mentioned, like this sports bot, well, it would have to be able to answer questions about athletes or teams, you know, so it would have a question answering component. It would have to maybe have access to a real-time feed about a game. You know, there's a lot of stuff out there. And so I think that, you know, those of us like you and me that work on task-oriented dialogues, you know, for years, like for booking flights or making a hotel reservation or things like that, you kind of think of task-oriented dialogue systems as being about, you know, those specific kinds of transactions. But maybe from the task-oriented dialogue systems side, we have to kind of really open up our ideas about what we think a task-oriented dialogue is. You know, maybe that definition of a task-oriented dialogue is just too limited.
Too limited. Yes. Yeah. I would agree. And like all these forms of opportunities, especially in the companion space. And I like the sports sport example a lot. That would be quite interesting for and it could actually, like, so there's sports games, but there could also be other situations that would benefit from that form of
like live. I mean, I'm
companionship.
thinking being able to do stuff with live data that's actually changing minute by minute is a really exciting frontier that hasn't really been. I can't think of any really good exemplars that are out there that are in research or in companies. I can't think of a single good exemplar that's out there that could example talk about what happened in last night's episode of Ted Lasso. Right?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Oh, exactly. It could be any form of content, right? Like I cannot think of examples either, but it could be like the movie. It could be the thing that happened. It doesn't even need to happen in real time. It's okay. It probably better in certain cases to happen in real time, but it could be the movie last night or a book that you read last week. That
Something, yeah, the
having
best, something
someone
that's
to
very
discuss it with.
rich, recent, yeah,
Mhm,
rich,
mhm.
recent content.
Exactly. So I guess there are going to be like some more opportunities to, now that the technology has advanced a lot, there are going to be some more opportunities.
Yeah, because the training data has been such a bottleneck, and it's so liberating to imagine that instead of having to, like I was talking to a student yesterday about where we're going to get the training data for something, and then all of a sudden I thought we should try prompting, to generate the training data. I mean, you don't know until you try whether you can get good quality training data out of a language model. That to me right now is the single most exciting thing about the large language models, is the ability to generate synthetic training data.
And then the prompts, providing the annotations and so on.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so for example, if you had open access to some very large model like GPT-4 right now, what are some of the things that you would do? Because some of these are actually closed, so we do not know what is happening inside the model. But anything pops up.
So I would like to do a lot. I would like to do a lot of experiments, maybe, over the next 6 months. I'd like to try a lot of different ways of trying to generate whole dialogues, maybe ones with annotations that would support training controllable, learning a policy or training a controllable NLG. I think like the idea of being able to generate whole dialogues, and then I suppose, I saw a paper that came out. I just saw a paper in the last few days that popped up in my Google Scholar about using GPT for, maybe it was even GPT-4, but using it for evaluation, to have the language model tell you whether the output is good. And evaluation has been such a restriction. The field, it's been something, as you might remember, like when we were both at AT&T, like 2000, one of the things that AT&T really wanted was a way to evaluate a dialogue system, like a single number. And, here it is, it's like whatever, 23 years later, and we're still trying to figure out like what's a good way to evaluate a dialogue system. So, I don't think there's necessarily a silver bullet out there of being able to use language model for evaluation. But if you could use language model to evaluate some aspects of the output, people already, I guess, are doing that, just using like language model probabilities to evaluate fluency. But, I think, the possibility of using language models to do evaluation is something I would be interested in looking at, to see if there are things that you could do now that you couldn't do even at like a year ago.
And maybe since you brought up the very challenging topic of evaluation, and that some of these large language models, they are evaluated for a variety of tasks, but not necessarily for the purposes of dialogue per se. What would be like some suggestions that you would make? Like if I were to train the even bigger large language model tomorrow, what would you like to see in terms of evaluating that language model for the purposes of dialogue? What message should we give, like as the dialogue community, to the language modeling folks?
Well, there are so many different dimensions to dialogue evaluation. Even if you just think about the things that have been used, to do reinforcement learning with human feedback, right? Like, is it biased? Is it toxic? Is it interesting? At the utterance level, There's so many different components that you want, but I mean, obviously, those things are really important. You know, is it biased? Is it toxic? Is it truthful? Though the kind of in terms of a dialogue system manifesto, those seem to be like three things that you really want to be able to tell, right? Whether it's biased, toxic, and truthful. And the fact that it's so difficult to detect hallucinations right now, it seems to be like you can detect a hallucination. Like if you're doing meaning to text generation, you can detect a hallucination where a known slot has the wrong value, right? But you typically get a lot of extra verbiage or things that the generator might produce that's part of the utterance, and a lot of that stuff is stuff you want because it's makes the utterance interesting and diverse. But we don't have, you know, so basically that's a real problem, that we don't have good methods for identifying when the system's being truthful. I mean, you saw that in the demo that Google gave of Bard. The system told a lie, and nobody. I mean, they gave a canned demo, recorded demo that had the system telling a lie, and nobody saw it ahead of time, right?
Yeah, I mean, like with interactions with these systems, even I had a few cases where I was deceived by the answer of these systems because they seem so convincing.
Right? Yes, that's actually
really scary.
I mean, at least for toxicity and bias, you can recognize it, right? You can recognize it. You can imagine that you can have, you know, humans easily annotate that this is toxic, this is biased. Maybe not so easily. Like I think Emily Dinnan has an example of a Blender bot version of a system saying something like, I like to hang out in the park where there are old people because then it's easy to steal their wallets. And right. So you don't really want, you know, your dialogue system to say things like that. But she's saying there's so many different varieties of things that you wouldn't want your system to say that it's hard to figure out, like, how are you going to recognize that stealing wallets from old people is something that, you know, without some kind of really good social common sense reasoning. So, but I think the thing about the hallucinations, I think to me, that's the most worrying thing. And it's the hardest. It's really hard, even when you're doing meaning to text generation. So even in that very restricted setting, it's hard to recognize hallucinations.
Yeah, exactly. So in the interest of time, what are some of the things that you think I should or we should as a community focus on moving on? Anything that I'm forgetting to bring up?
Well, I think I was going to say about evaluation that some of that there's these possibilities now for seeming to do interactive evaluation of systems that's a lot easier than it used to be, like the Lego eval system that you used in your Places paper, where you can just hook up a language model and you can have an interactive evaluation with that. That's a really interesting development, that you can put something out there, or like, I suppose even the way like people are using the demo page for ChatGPT to test it, and everybody's putting out a demo page and having people test it. I think that's a big step forward to having stuff out there that people can test and you can kind of see what happens with it. But I think that's it's still really challenging, that the whole, I mean, a lot of times people think that evaluation is boring, you know, like figuring out how to do evaluation of a system, that it's boring. But I still think it's really important to kind of come up with a list of criteria that everybody could agree on, that would apply across social conversation as well as task-oriented dialogue, that are definitely the things that you have to be able to ensure that the system does or doesn't do. right?
Exactly, and something that is replicable so that you can actually compare, like even two versions of a similar model,
Right.
or two very different models, and so on. Yes, yeah, that I think still remains as one of the biggest challenges.
And I suppose the thing, I suppose there's other kinds of things, like so much of the work now is still just being done for English.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm, finding ways to make it so that people that speak other languages aren't disenfranchised in this,
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
kind of new world where all the language models are trained. All the newest, largest language models are all trained on English, and there just doesn't exist the kind of data for other languages. I think that's something that,
yes, or even
what the government should be investing money on. If you think about our field, the reason why speech recognition finally got good enough to be used in commercial settings was because of 25 years of DARPA investment in speech recognition. But I haven't seen the same kind of investment. I mean, maybe the government doesn't think that they need to do it because the companies are doing it anyway, but the companies have a profit motive, and the government could actually have a, National Science Foundation and DARPA or IARPA, all the funding agencies, federal funding agencies, could have a huge impact on taking the field in the right direction.
I completely agree on that.
Yeah, and I
think it would be wrong to wait companies or industry to do this, because they're not, like you say, they have a very big
the federal government right now. Like, why isn't the federal government hosting an API for a large language model that everybody could use without having to pay for? That would really level the playing field as far as research goes. I mean, there is a real problem now with, like, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And, the cost of running the language models and the computing costs, things like that, mean that universities like UCSC, I mean, I'm lucky that I have money that I can use to spend on those things. But, some young person just starting in the field, might be, or in a smaller university. So anyway, I think that that's one thing that I don't hear very many people talking about or paying attention to. I don't think there hasn't been a large government program on dialogue since DARPA.
Not yet. Not that I know of either. Yes,
No,
exactly.
right?
Okay. Thank you so much, Lynn. It has been a great conversation.
All right. Thanks. I talk to you soon.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.